So welcome to this session. My name is Dan Rayburn. I'm the conference chairman. Today I'm talking with Chris Sock from Adobe, and we have a lot of good data to share here because, God, I don't remember when it was, Chris, but at least a couple months ago, I teamed up with Adobe to go out into the market and collect data. If you heard my keynote this morning, I love data that has good methodology behind it, so it was great that Adobe reached out and said, let's work together to create some real methodology around the ad stack, the challenges that publishers are having. So we actually did a webinar last week where we presented a lot of the data. Adobe has two great, I don't really call them white papers, but two papers where we put out a review of all the data, what we collected, what the impact is. So we're going to go through some of that today. We're going to talk about the highlights of some of that. Before we do that, Chris, let's just jump off in terms of what you do at Adobe. Adobe's obviously large. You've been in the video space a long time as well. God, how long, right? 20 years
yeah,
at least?
Long time.
And originally with Adobe, right? So maybe just talk about that, because I think that's interesting, the whole FMS days. And
Yeah, originally with actually Macromedia back in the day, launching this little thing called Flash Video that getting exciting times like getting, ABC's full episodes of Lost and, obviously countless others have started streaming TV on the internet, kind of changing the history of how TV is delivered. So my role at Adobe, I'm a boomerang. I left and I came back. My role now is really focused on driving solutions for media and entertainment customers at Adobe's. The Adobe Experience Cloud side of the business. So really how do you use data to transform digital experiences? And my focus is on media and entertainment.
Great, thank you. Can we go to slide 5, please? So measuring viewer experience, super important. One of the things that we looked at was just how important is it to publishers out there? So you can see from the data here, only 21% measure viewer experience and feel that it's good. Only 21%. All right, that's too low. And we're going to talk about later what that means from a KPI standpoint in terms of how much money is actually being lost, and it's a big number.
Yeah.
And we're probably underestimating that. But why aren't more publishers measuring that experience?
Yeah, it's a good question. When we looked at this, the data, it's like 16% of them say they're not measuring. They might be, public broadcasters or, SVOD folks that are subscription-based rather than kind of ad-based. There's a chunk here, 5%, that don't know how to measure. That seems like an opportunity to solve. But out of the remainders, as Dan said, only 21% measured the experience and believe the viewer experience is good. So I think there's a lot of room to grow here. There's a good chunk here, about 40%, that measure, but they don't think the viewer experience is good as it pertains to ads and viewers sitting through ad payloads and having a great experience. So a lot of room for improvement.
For sure. And one thing we didn't want to do is just collect data that says, the experience isn't good. That's like some of the data we see in the market that says churn is high. We'll define high. So next slide, please. What we wanted to do is what are the actual factors that influence the ad experience? Too many ads was number one, which I actually thought was interesting. I thought it was going to be repetitive ads, which is number 3 at 31%. As I said in the webinar, I had no idea loud ad audio was that big of a problem, but it is. But now look at the last one here. Poor ad video quality. Right? I think that's interesting because, as I mentioned in the morning in the keynote, 2022 is the 26th year of streaming on the internet. We've gotten to a point where the actual quality of the video ad itself is the lowest problem that publishers feel is an issue in the industry.
Yeah, you think back to the days and swapping out players to, for the content versus the ad, having multi-players. You had, bandwidth issues. It seems like a lot of that, compression was still kind of in its infancy for delivering on the web. A lot of that has kind of, gone on the wayside. We solved those problems. Now it's like, okay, what's the model when we take TV and we transition it over to the web? Is it still going to be 16 minutes of ads in an hour of programming? if it's just 30-second ads, that might be too much, right? And you see a lot of people playing with the ad payloads, but according to our survey here, still too many ads is a key takeaway. I think the other thing I found kind of interesting was there's no one thing that's...
Right, it's multiple.
Right, like too many ads, irrelevant ads, repetitive ads, all are in that kind of 30% or above, which may mean, hey, not only do we have to personalize the ads for the viewer, but also personalize the experiences. What types of ads, short form, longer form, storyboarding with ads, watch ads up front. Like maybe there's different, experiences that we have to consider rather than, the 7 minutes of content, break for an ad, 2 to 3 ads in the pod, 7 minutes of content, and so forth, right? Maybe we have to rethink that whole ad experience.
So that's ad load and formatting, but let's talk just from a technical standpoint without going too deep. Really, what is causing some of these problems, right? Because we see issues with stream stitching. We see issues where no ad is loaded at all. It's triggering issues. So what are some of those things that you're seeing from publishers?
Yeah, we have some good details on that later. Maybe we can wait for
that works.
That side.
So if we can go to 2 more slides in, please. So we're talking here about how ads are sold, and we have quite a bit of data on that in the slides. We're not going to go through all those slides because it's quite a bit, but maybe let's just go to programmatic since we're hearing a lot about that. So if you can go 2 more slides, please. So this slide is telling you that 81% of companies are using programmatic. And I thought it was also interesting in terms of how many are moving towards direct sold. So maybe talk about what you're seeing in the market as far as how that is changing.
Yeah, I think the kind of programmatic is my takeaway is it's here. It's folks are using it today. The majority of folks are using it. When we asked this question, we wanted to see not how many are using it, but then what was the propensity in the future? Where were they going? Were they going to do more programmatic? Where and you might think, well, it's still starting. There's a lot of run room for more programmatic. But actually, what we kind of found here is there's a relatively small amount that said, yeah, we're going to shift to more programmatic. So 12%. But there's actually about that same amount, maybe a little bit more, said, well, we're actually going to shift to direct sold, right? And this, this may be, some of these newer companies that are starting out with programmatic, 100% programmatic, and now they're starting to say, well, for bigger deals, maybe I want to get a direct sales force to have more flexibility in how I can sell. So I think we're kind of seeing that the majority of companies are using programmatic today, and going forward, it's going to be a mix of both programmatic and direct sold.
So we talk a lot about just the phrase, the currency of advertising. We use that. So, really what is that and how is that changing? Because that's changed quite a bit in the industry and will continue to.
Yeah, there's a lot of talk about audiences being new currency, identity being the new currency. We at Adobe definitely believe this. We have, out of the top 200, Ad Age's top 200 advertisers, about 76% have their first-party data in one of the Adobe Experience Cloud solutions. So we definitely want to enable those customers to take advantage of that first-party data on paid media. So, search and be able to run ads based on their own defined audiences, and performance, KPIs that they want to hit. So definitely performance-based and audience-based currencies in the future are where to go. One of the things that we kind of skipped over a little bit in the past is, though, how much demo still is factoring into the way people sell today. And that was, I think, a little bit surprising. So like 50% of inventory is being sold on demo, especially with the larger companies.
Gender, yeah. I didn't want to hit every single slide.
Yeah, no.
We're going to run out of time.
Right.
We're going to be talking about, we're talking monetization now. And we're going to be showing a slide in inventory waste, right? So we're going to show a big number in a minute, but maybe just give people an idea leading up to that slide of how much wasted inventory there still is and why that problem exists.
Yeah, it's another interesting stat. We found that about 72% of companies say when they are guaranteeing on for example, a Nielsen agent gender, for example, that there is still an amount of significant inventory waste. So what that means is if you want to hit an audience and guarantee it for an advertiser that is maybe female 25 to 54, and you want to guarantee 1 million impressions, well, you got to deliver like 1.2, 1.5, 1.6 million impressions, so you make sure you hit that guarantee. So that wastage is significant. And again, 72% of companies said over 10% of their inventory goes to those guarantees that waste.
So imagine other industries and other businesses where 10% is waste. I mean, that would put some companies under from an efficiency standpoint. If we can go to the next slide, please. So here's the number in terms of what does this mean from a business standpoint? Next slide, please. Next slide. You're going backwards instead of forwards.
No, I think you got it.
Oh.
Previous one.
What? One back?
One back.
There you go. So
yeah.
Talk to that number.
Yeah, $1.6 billion. So if you just take the size of the market for streaming ads, we'll use Group M, $16.5 billion market here, and you take 10% of that is lost. That's $1.6 billion in lost ad dollars here that the industry is kind of grappling with. So definitely a lot of ways that we can get more efficient and solve that problem. We talked a bit about inventory waste on guarantees being one way that you can solve it and start recapturing some of these dollars. This slide, another question that we asked is what Dan was alluding to earlier. What is the errors in the kind of dynamic ad insertion process, and how much are those errors impacting folks? Again, this is another one where it's 10% or more. Almost all companies have some form of error in the ad insertion process. So whether this is malformed, vast responses, or ads that weren't encoded correctly, or timeouts or latency in the response. Almost all companies had some errors. Over half of them, that error rate was 10% or higher, and that's, again, significant amount of dollars lost.
That's staggering, right? Over 54%, 10% or higher. I mean, that's a big number.
Yeah.
And I think probably 1.6 billion is probably low.
Yeah.
Right? If we recalculated that, it's probably low.
Yep.
So let's keep talking some of the technology ad side. You're talking about errors, ad insertion, we're talking scope. If we can go to the next slide, please. Talking about just hybrid, client, server side. What is it we really want to get across here with this?
Yeah, I think the kind of question that we want to dig is, how are folks doing this ad insertion? If there are a lot of problems here, how can we look at some of the technology to maybe solve some of these problems? So we kind of had a question around your dynamic ad insertion really done on the server side, or is it done on the client side? What we found is with smaller organizations are predominantly server side. This may be because they are starting a little bit more recently, and they're using the latest and greatest server side technology, or maybe because they're getting a bundle ad insertion thrown in with their video platform delivery and their transcoding. But I think some of those reasons may indicate why some of the smaller companies are doing server side ad insertion. You look at the larger companies though, man, they're doing both, right? And there might be a lot of historical reasons for this. The larger companies have maybe traditional platforms that had client-side ad insertion. Now they're shifting and they're maybe in flux. But I think as we started talking to folks about their infrastructure, it seems like there are some pieces of the whole ad process that are going to remain on the client. Measurements as MRC guidelines are dictating more client-side tracking of ads. Well, that has to stay on the client's interactivity. So there's going to be a lot of room for what we view as this hybrid scenario where some intelligence happens on the server and other happens on the client.
For those that want the copies of the slide, just email me, dan@danrayburn.com. I'll send you a link to Adobe's site where you can download all the data, both of the white papers. Super easy. They already have it up. I think we published it last week. I forget what day, but it's already online. You can find it on Adobe's site. If it's easier to email me, just go ahead and do that. Next slide, please. So this is interesting too. We're talking about how many vendors are organizations using.
Yeah, we kind of looked at this as, with all the consolidation happening in the market, you might say, yeah, there's probably a lot of companies that have multiple ad insertion vendors. And, indeed, there are, in this case, about 50% that have, multiple vendors. But then we ask kind of the question of, okay, if the dust is settling, maybe if this is a result of acquisitions, maybe in roll-ups, if the dust settles, what's your future state? Do you go to one vendor? And and surprisingly, it looked like in the future, the next 12 to 24 months, people were not only kind of maybe going to stay with multiple vendors, but maybe double down on this. And kind of Dan, we went through this kind of like CDN industry where maybe it was you relied on one CDN and then you started going to multi-CDN
comparisons. Yeah.
And and this indicates maybe we're kind of there with ad insertion. Certainly you want maybe a second vendor for redundancy. And
but 3 to 5 seems excessive or more.
yes, that's probably a lot of acquisitions.
How do you manage even just the data you're collecting across 5 different vendors?
Yeah, it's another opportunity for that. But I think for different vendors doing different use cases, different vendors for optimizing ad delivery costs, different vendor for optimizing delivery performance, depending on the use case. Maybe even 2 to get a better deal when you're negotiating.
Maybe a quick follow-up question on this. Do we think this is changing? Do you think this is changing based on live or on demand? If you're doing live or live linear or fast, does that change in terms of the number of vendors you're using?
I think that might be a use case. If you're doing on demand, it's a relatively simple ad insertion experience, and maybe you have one vendor for that. And if you're doing complex live streams, especially that require HLS, Dash and CMAF, and that might be a different vendor than someone that can deliver VOD for you.
Yeah, that's a good point. We're going to get to questions because I know people are going to have a couple questions. We'll do just a few, but next slide, please. So just talk to this, Chris, in terms of the points you think are most important, because one of the things we didn't want to do is just do a survey and say, hey, some things stink. Right? Like, that's not enough. Okay, well, how do you fix it? What are some guidelines? What are some recommendations that you're making? So talk to, basically you call it a 7-step recommended guide, but talk to some things that you're really reinforcing with companies when this problem is coming up.
Yeah, I think you can kind of lump these 7 recommendations into maybe a couple of broad buckets. One is certainly on the measurement piece of it, and kind of implied here is you're measuring a viewer's engagement, so it's knowing the viewer, and this is where we believe maybe a relook at the traditional architecture is maybe needed. So in your ad insertion process, in your measurement process, making sure that you understand who the viewer is. So unifying the data around a identity, a user, and then being able to measure against that becomes pretty important. And I think the second kind of bucket is this complexity of multi DAI vendors and multi client-side versus client-side and server-side. That requires maybe a back-end technology that normalizes data, normalizes business rules against those environments. So, down to your data point, or to your point about, hey, aren't you going to have a lot of data here? Yeah. That's another, I think, kind of architectural implication of this.
The other thing here, in terms of when you're talking about currencies and the ad waste, does the ad waste change as far as when you're delivering ads in other countries in terms of where we talk about currencies here, but where it costs more from a CPM standpoint? So is more money being lost in certain regions of the world based on this?
Yeah, it's a good point. I wonder, we didn't kind of do too much geography here. I think a lot of this was U.S. focused, but it would be interesting to do a study kind of overseas and see how some of this data changes. It may be that in some areas they're selling less on age and gender demo and maybe more on Persons 2+, or there may be other kind of implications of some of the technology in the back end and ad insertion problems that may or may not be different.
Did you want to do this last slide? Do you want that one?
No, I think,
I didn't think you needed it.
yeah.
So with that, let's just go to questions real quick because we are running out of time here. I do want to try and keep things on time. So if you have a question, raise your hand. We're not going to run around with a mic. Can't see. I don't think we are. Go ahead, sir. Yes. Sorry, I can't see you with the lights, but yes, I see a hand.
Do you have an idea about the CPM price between server-side ad insertion and client-side ad insertion?
So the question is, do you have a CPM, not CDN, CPM price between client-side and server-side ad insertion? Well, I already know how you're going to answer that. I mean, that's like saying, what does a new car cost? I don't know, what do you want? But it's a fair question, CPMs. Let's just address it because, frankly, the industry does not put out a lot of information on CPMs.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I don't know if there's a difference that's based on the technology per se. However, I might think that there may be a difference based on the content. So I would say that client-side ad insertion may be still used a lot where video is just one element on a page that has maybe text and a bunch of other stuff. Maybe it's a banner. And that may drive less of an engagement, hence less of a CPM, versus server-side ad insertion used more on full episode playback and more of an engagement, and therefore, and use server-side ad insertion to, make an optimal stream, and that may command a higher CPM. So there may be, server-side, yes, it gets higher CPMs than client-side, but that may be kind of for the content and the experience reasons.
And you ask a good question only because, again, I'm a data head. I love data. And one of the things we haven't had in our industry in a long time is information on CPMs. Right? Publishers do not want to talk about what they're getting. Advertisers don't want to say what they pay. Part of the reason, too, to be honest with you, is that I don't have a lot of sessions in the program this year or previous years around online video advertising is because nobody will come on stage and talk CPMs. They just won't. They don't want to talk about it. So that's part of a problem. Vendors won't talk about it, how much money they're making. Ad networks won't talk, ad exchanges, ad platforms. But the problem is that as an industry, how do we then know how we're growing or success or failure? So CPMs is an interesting question. There's a lot there in that. We have time for one more question if someone has one. If not, we're going to pass it off to the next session. No? Okay. Oh, sorry. I see a hand up there. Go ahead, sir. Hopefully it's a short question.
Yeah, I think the question was, we mentioned 1.6 billion is a loss of revenue lost on an annual basis to ad insertion errors. Can we break that down to maybe what the errors are? And I don't think we have really good, we didn't ask that, go deep into that question here. I think that would be a great follow-up one. I know it's certainly something that at Adobe that we are building in our software to help publishers kind of quantify which of the errors, whether it's, again, a technical error around, the server health, or it's a technical area around the ad performance. We're trying to provide transparency and visibility into that.
And that's a great point. This survey really focused definitely more on the business side. And talk to more business executives, but we could do an entire survey just around the technical stack and the challenges, and talk to the folks that are dealing with that every day to complement this. That would certainly be a good thing. So with that, we're out of time. I'd like to thank Chris. We're going to take like literally a 1-minute break. We're just going to get new speakers up here, and we're going to kick into the next session. If you have a question for Chris, do you mind stepping outside in the hall?
I'll be outside.
That way we can get the others up here. Thanks very much.
Thank you.